Dolly Parton isn't just the queen of country, she's the heartbeat of American soul. The woman whose voice once wrapped our pain in silk and sent it back to us as hope. But tonight, that same voice stands at the edge of silence. Her sister, Freda Parton, posted in the middle of the night, "I was up all night praying for my sister Dolly. Many of you know she hasn't been feeling her best lately. I truly believe in the power of prayer, and I have been led to ask all of the world that loves her to be prayer warriors and pray with me." When words like these come from blood, you know the worry is real. For over 6 decades, Dolly Go of the world Jolene, coat of many colors, and I will always love you. Songs that turned heartbreak into healing and loneliness into light. She rose from the cold hills of Tennessee to the thrones of music history, carrying grace where others carried scars. And now at 79, as the Las Vegas lights go dim and the world holds its breath, we are left wondering, will the voice that once healed millions find its own strength again? Don't look away, because what she's facing now may be her hardest song yet. Before we begin, honor Dolly Parton with a light. A prayer for the woman who gave us her heart in every note and still hasn't stopped giving. Some souls come into this world already bruised, carrying wounds too deep for the innocence of childhood to ever mend. Dolly Rebecca Parton was one of them. Long before doctors' words or headlines of concern ever brushed her name, she had already learned the secret art of survival. Not in hospitals, but in the hollows of the great Smoky Mountains that raised her. Born on January 19, 1946, in Sevier County, Tennessee, her first lullaby was the wind moaning through pine and timber. Her cradle was a one-room cabin crouched between the ridges. No electricity, no running water, just the hush of the mountains and a mother's labored breathing. Her parents were so poor, they paid the doctor who delivered her with a sack of cornmeal. That night, as her family would later tell her, the cold pressed through the thin walls like a living thing. The stars outside burned bright, but far away, as if even heaven was keeping its distance. Inside, her mother, A.V. Lee, lay beneath a quilt frayed by too many winters, her sweat mixing with the mountain chill. Hope, not fire, was the only warmth they could afford. The Partons weren't merely poor, they wore poverty like a second skin, like weather that never broke, a cold that settled into the bones and stayed. Winters in those mountains stretched long enough to forget spring. The wind had teeth. It bit through quilts and skin alike, rattling the boards until the whole cabin seemed to shiver. Dolly would wake in the dark when the air itself felt brittle, her breath clouding before her face. 12 children, one blanket. They clung to one another as the night creaked and groaned around them. "It was the only warm thing we knew," she would later say, smiling through the ache of memory. Summers offered no mercy. Baths in the river where the water stung like glass. Bare feet cut on stone. The smell of wet wood and smoke that lingered in their hair. But those nights of cold and hunger were her first teachers. They taught her how to breathe through pain, how to find rhythm in the silence, lessons her body still remembers. Her father, Robert Lee Parton, could not read or write, yet his hands spoke fluent sacrifice. They were cracked and calloused, darkened by work and worry, steady as mountains. He rose before the light did, his breath already fogging the dawn, working the fields, hauling gravel, doing anything to keep 13 plates from going empty. Her mother, A.V. Lee, moved like a hymn, soft, endless, exhausted. 35, 12 children, and still she sewed until her fingers forgot tenderness. She sang while she cooked, her voice thin but determined, weaving stories to keep the darkness at bay. By 6, Dolly had become a caretaker, fetching water from the creek, rocking babies to sleep, stirring beans over the wood stove until the smoke made her eyes sting. She owned no toys, no dolls, no silks, only the truth that love meant labor, and that the purest faith was found in endurance. Then came 1955. Dolly was 9 when silence fell heavier than the mountain snow. Her baby brother, Larry, lived for only 4 days. There was no funeral, no headstone, only a patch of earth behind the house where sorrow learned to breathe. Her mother sat in stillness, hands folded like broken wings. Her father's footsteps grew longer, his shoulders heavier, and the little girl who sang to fill quiet now met a silence that would never answer back. She carried it inside her for life. Later, she would admit that some songs were conversations with the brother she barely met, whispers to a child who had never learned to speak. School brought no refuge. One winter, her mother stitched her a coat from scraps, each patch chosen with love. Each color meant as pride. But in class, laughter stung sharper than the wind outside. To the other children, it was rags. To Dolly, it was her mother's heart sewn into cloth. She held her chin high and walked home through the snow, her tears hot against the cold. Years later, that humiliation became redemption in coat of many colors, a song born from the bruise of ridicule, a hymn to dignity and love. Even decades later, she could barely sing it after her mother's passing in 2003, her voice breaking where memories still hurt. By 7, music had already become her shelter, her rebellion, her prayer. She wrote songs before she could spell them, turning hunger into melody, loneliness into lullaby, grief into something that could be held without breaking. She sang to warm herself. She sang to fill the hollow her brother left. She sang so the darkness would not win. "I didn't write to be famous," she would whisper years later. "I wrote to survive." And every bitter winter, every long walk to school, every scrap of fabric stitched by her mother's hands became part of the instrument she carried inside, a voice that could lift pain out of silence and turn it into grace. Long before the rhinestones, long before the applause, that voice was her only shield, born in hunger, tempered by cold, sharpened by loss. It was the song of a child who learned that even when the world gives you nothing, you can still make something beautiful out of it. That same child lives within her still, quiet, unyielding, waiting for the next dawn. Because for Dolly Parton, the music was never just melody. It was survival itself. And every time she sings, even now, somewhere deep inside, that little girl from the Smoky Mountains still hums through the dark, defiant, tender, and unbroken. No one could have imagined that the barefoot girl singing into the winds of Tennessee, her voice echoing through the endless folds of the great Smoky Mountains, would one day stand beneath the world's brightest lights. Back then, her audience was the forest itself, the trees, the creek, and the echo of her own faith. Her songs rose like smoke into the hills, soft but unbreakable. By the time Dolly Parton was 10, that fragile little girl carried a voice so clear it stopped strangers in their tracks. In 1956, she began traveling with her uncle Bill Owens, chasing radio towers and backroom studios like fireflies in the dark. Their car was old, the gas tank half full, but their dreams were overflowing. The suitcases they carried held more songs than clothes. Sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, notebooks blurred with rain, and a hope so heavy it bent the air around them. They slept on borrowed couches, church pews, and sometimes the back seat of a tired Chevy parked under the Tennessee sky. It was exciting, hungry, and heartbreaking all at once, she would later say. And it was. Nights when the stars looked close enough to touch, and mornings when they woke with frost on the windows and nothing but a melody to keep them warm. A childhood both rich in dreams and poor in everything else. When she graduated from Sevier County High School in the spring of 1964, there was no celebration, no music, no bouquet, just silence and resolve. While others posed for photos, she stood alone on a dirt road at sunrise, a cardboard suitcase in one hand and a bus ticket in the other, $20 in her pocket. A promise whispered to herself, "I'll make it, or I won't come back at all." The Greyhound rolled away from the mountains that had raised her, and she watched them shrink in the rear-view mirror until they were only ghosts. Nashville greeted her with a shimmer, neon lights that looked warm from afar, but burned cold up close. Doors closed. Voices mocked her accent. Some called her sweetheart and never called again. At night, in the tiny room she rented by the week, she would stare out the window at the rain-slicked streets, listening to the hum of cars she couldn't afford to ride. The silence in that room pressed harder than the mountain cold. "There were nights," she once said softly, "when I sang just to keep from disappearing." On those nights, she folded her hands and whispered the same prayer her mother had taught her back home. "Keep going, girl. Just keep going." 1965. The miracle came and cut both ways. Monument Records offered her a contract, but miracles, she would learn, come with conditions. They said her voice was too country, too mountain, too much. They wanted her to sound softer, smoother, a girl dipped in sugar instead of smoke. They handed her songs like "Happy, Happy Birthday, Baby," and "What Do You Think About Lovin'," and told her to smile wider. Under the harsh lights of the EDVD studio, she sang perfectly, but each note felt like someone else's truth. I felt like I was wearing someone else's skin. She would later admit, the kind of line that breaks your heart precisely because it's whispered, not shouted. When the singles failed, the phone stopped ringing. The label cooled, but Dolly's fire was not made for dimming. By day, she played in smoky bars where drunks barely looked up from their drinks. By night, she wrote. By candlelight, when the power was cut, her words scrawled across envelopes, receipts, the backs of old flyers. Her hands cramped, her stomach ached, her voice trembled from exhaustion, but she kept going. I used to hum just to hear something alive she'd recall years later. And somewhere in that ache, she found her own sound. Then came 1966, a small song, "Put It Off Until Tomorrow," one she co-wrote with Uncle Bill, slipped into the world through singer Bill Phillips. It soared to #1. And just like that, the wind changed direction. In every office on Music Row, people began asking, "Who's Dolly Parton?" The answer came in 1967 with her debut album, "Hello, I'm Dolly." It wasn't just an introduction, it was a declaration of self. Those songs weren't fantasies. They were the truth carved from hunger and hope, from nights when she sang to the dark because no one else would listen. They told of loss, faith, and rebellion, the quiet kind that blooms in women who've learned to stand tall in small rooms. Nashville still underestimated her. Some saw a novelty, some saw a smile, but behind that sweetness was steel. Beneath those sequins lived the same barefoot child who had once sung to the mountains just to survive. "I didn't come all this way to be told who I am," she would later say. And in 1973, she proved it. She wrote her goodbye, not to fame, but to the cage. "I will always love you." It wasn't merely a song. It was liberation wrapped in grace. a farewell that forgave a wound turned holy. When she sang it, the world fell still because somehow through her voice, every listener heard their own heartbreak heal. From that moment on, no one could keep her in the shadows again. Dolly Parton's climb to the top of country music was never a graceful rise. It was survival, fought not on a battlefield but beneath blinding stage lights. By 1970, she had carved her own corner on the Porter Wagoner show, her golden voice flowing into millions of living rooms every week. On screen, she was sunshine, radiant, effortless, flawless. Off screen, she was unraveling. Behind every smile, creative tension tightened its grip. Each time she wrote a song that cut too deep, too true, the room grew colder. I felt like I was standing in somebody else's shadow, she would later confess. Not with bitterness, but fatigue. Her pen was too honest for an industry that preferred its women, soft-spoken and obedient. Porter, both mentor and warden, couldn't see that his pupil had outgrown her cage. She loved him, respected him, but love could not save her from suffocation. By 1974, the choice she feared most became the one she could no longer avoid. She would walk away from the man who had opened every door and the show that had defined her name. It wasn't rebellion, it was survival. That farewell wasn't shouted, it was sung. I will always love you. The words rose like a prayer, a love letter stitched together with pain too tender for anger. I cried all the way to the top of the charts, she admitted years later. And she meant it. The song didn't just close a chapter, it buried a part of her heart. When the applause came, it hurt because success born from loss feels more like mourning than triumph. Behind the curtain, she stood alone, mascara streaked, chest rising with sobs, whispering to herself, "You did the right thing." But Dolly had already proven her power long before that goodbye. A year earlier, she'd released Jolene, a song so hauntingly simple, it cut through the noise like a whisper through thunder. Its plea was raw, human, trembling, a confession turned melody. It wasn't just a hit, she later said, it was a mirror. But mirrors can wound, and Nashville still tried to box her in. A novelty, a duet girl, too pretty to be profound. They didn't see the storm gathering behind that smile. By day, she filmed and performed. By night, she wrote, alone in motel rooms where exhaustion hung heavy in the air. Her hands cramped, ink smeared by sweat or tears, her coffee gone cold. Writing was how I fought my battles, she said. Every melody was a way to breathe. There were nights she fell asleep sitting upright, guitar in her lap, strings pressed into her skin like scars, proof she'd survived another day. The mid-1970s tested her body and soul like never before. Endless tours, cameras, interviews, radio promos, studio sessions that bled into sunrise. Her voice, once clear as a mountain stream, now rasped under the strain. Her fingers blistered, her back ached from corsets and costumes. She learned how to hide fatigue behind brine stones, how to turn pain into glitter. Some nights, she'd walk off stage and collapse in the dressing room, her sequins clattering against the tile floor. Assistants would lift her, and she'd laugh it off. "Guess I sparkled too hard tonight." But when the lights went out, her body trembled from sheer exhaustion. Still, she refused to surrender her story. When others told her to rest, she wrote instead. When they told her to compromise, she doubled down. "I won't be reduced to a formula," she vowed, even if that defiance cost her sleep, sanity, and health. Then, in 1977, the storm broke into sunlight. Here You Come Again, shattered boundaries, soaring to #1 on the country chart and into the pop top 3. Purists accused her of betrayal. She smiled and answered, "I wasn't leaving country. I was taking it with me." Those words were not just defiance, they were faith. Her body may have been running on fumes, but her spirit had never burned brighter. Then came 1980, 9 to 5. Written in one sleepless night on a film set beside Jane Fonda and Lily Tomlin, it was more than a song. It was a war cry disguised as a melody, a hymn for every woman who had worked herself past the breaking point and kept going anyway. The anthem dominated charts across every genre, and the world cheered. But Dolly was unraveling behind the applause. The schedule was merciless. 12-hour film shoots, studio sessions, red carpets, flights, interviews, performances. She lived on coffee and adrenaline. Some nights, she said softly, I'd look in the mirror and not recognize the girl staring back. The smile was there. The hair, the lashes. But behind the sparkle lived a woman running on painkillers, prayers, and willpower. Yet somehow she kept singing because for her, music was medicine, the one thing that could still hold her together. The mid-1980s brought a new storm, the kind that doesn't roar, but lingers. Music was shifting. Trends came and went like summer rain. Dolly didn't chase them. She simply stood her ground. Tennessee. Homesick Blues, 1984, and Why'd You Come In Here? Looking Like That, 1989, proved she could evolve without erasing herself. If I tried to chase trends, she said, I'd just get lost in the crowd. Behind that calm tone was exhaustion, but also acceptance. The wisdom that comes when you've already survived the impossible. By the decade's end, Dolly Parton wasn't just at the summit of her career. She had reshaped the mountain itself. Her voice became one of America's sacred sounds. Her pen, a living archive of heartbreak, endurance, and grace. The road there was paved with sleepless nights. Raw fingertips, loneliness, and doubt. She had burned her body for her art, and yet through it all, her faith remained. Steady as the Smoky Mountains she once sang to. Deep down, she still carried the barefoot child who learned to sing through the cold. And now, after every triumph and scar, she had become the living proof of her own song. That even pain, when sung with truth, can turn into something holy. Even in the brightest moments of her career, when the spotlights bathed her in gold and the applause roared like an ocean without end, there were nights when Dolly Parton's thoughts slipped far beyond the glitter. Between the thunder of ovations and the low hum of the tour bus rolling through sleeping towns, silence had a way of finding her. In that silence, memories returned, not as nostalgia, but as ghosts. She would close her eyes and find herself back in Locust Ridge, Tennessee, 1955. Back in that weathered cabin where life and loss shared the same small space. The walls, patched with thin boards and prayer, had once echoed with her mother's lullabies and her father's quiet labor. But when her baby brother Larry came into the world and left it just 4 days later, the music stopped. There was no funeral, no gravestone, only a patch of earth behind the house that seemed to breathe with the family's sorrow. Dolly was 9, too young to understand death, yet old enough to feel the weight of it pressing into her bones. In her home, grief was not spoken. It was endured. Her mother's eyes carried what her lips could not say. Her father's hands worked longer, harder, as though muscle and sweat might somehow hold back heartbreak. And little Dolly, she listened. She watched. She learned that love, no matter how pure, could be fragile. That life could take something precious without ever explaining why. As the years passed and her fame reached impossible heights, that childhood ache never left her. It simply changed form. It became the quiet pulse beneath her music, the tremor in her voice that made strangers weep without knowing why. When she sang, "I Will Always Love You," a song born from professional farewell. The tenderness came from somewhere far older, somewhere buried deep in that mountain soil where her brother rested. Each note carried an echo of a lullaby she never got to sing, a promise to someone she barely knew, yet never stopped missing. In interviews, she would smile, that familiar, radiant smile. But if you listened closely, her voice softened when she admitted, "I think I've been singing to the people I've lost all my life." That loss, quiet, unspoken, buried under decades of resilience, became the unseen foundation of her art. It was the ache that gave her songs their truth, the compassion that made her voice feel like home to millions. Long after the trophies gleamed and the charts surrendered her name, her true triumph was never the applause. It was her ability to turn grief into grace. Each lyric, each melody was a way of giving back what life had taken. She had learned in that small cabin in Locust Ridge that love and loss were twin threads of the same cloth, one tearing, one mending, and that sometimes the most enduring gift we can offer the world is the sound of our own heart breaking beautifully. If Dolly Parton's music has a heartbeat, then its pulse, steady, warm, and eternal, belonged to her mother, A.V. Lee Parton. She wasn't merely the woman who brought Dolly into the world. She was the wellspring of her strength, the keeper of her tenderness, and the invisible thread woven through every note Dolly ever sang. Avi Lee was the mountain's voice before Dolly found her own, the hands that turned scarcity into grace and hardship into hymn. And when her mother passed away, something inside Dolly went still. The world saw the same radiant smile, the glittering gowns, the laughter that filled television screens, but behind that light, a silence settled. She would later say it felt as if the sun had set inside her. She kept touring, kept smiling, kept showing up for others because that's what her mama taught her. But even she admitted that for a long time. It felt like I was just walking through the days, not living them. A.V. Lee had been more than a mother. She was a miracle maker from nothing. It was her hands that stitched together the legendary coat of many colors from scraps of fabric and love, patch by patch, prayer by prayer, sewing into it not just cloth, but dignity, pride, and hope. That coat became one of Dolly's most cherished songs, an anthem of resilience that turned childhood humiliation into poetry. But after her mother was gone, the song was no longer just a melody. It was a wound. I'd try to sing it, she confessed, but I'd just lose it. It wasn't just a song. It was my mama's hands, my mama's voice, my mama's love. Some nights she stood on stage before thousands, her smile shining under the lights. But inside she was still that little girl listening for her mama's voice in the dark. Her grief, true to her roots, was quiet. Dolly had been raised in a home where sorrow was carried silently, like a stone in the pocket, always there, never shown. She mourned the way her mother had taught her, privately, deeply, in the spaces between concerts and interviews. Friends recalled finding her backstage, sitting alone, the original coat laid gently across her lap, her fingers tracing its seams like a map leading back to the cabin of her childhood. That coat had once warmed her when winter bit through the thin walls. Now it warmed her heart when the world felt cold. She remembered her mother's laughter echoing through the smoky mountain nights, her soft voice singing over the crackle of a wood stove, her gentle words stitching faith into her children. We may not have much, but we have enough if we have love. In time, Dolly began to speak of her mother not with tears, but with reverence. "My mama is in every good thing I've ever done," she told audiences, her voice trembling but proud. She told stories of A.V. Lee's wisdom, her songs hummed between chores, the way she could turn a worn apron into comfort, a hymn into healing. Dolly said she still dreamed of her, and in those dreams her mama wasn't gone. She was home. When she finally returned to Coat of Many Colors on stage years later, it sounded different. To the audience, it was a story of hope. To Dolly, it was communion. Every word a prayer, every note a memory. She felt her mother's hands again, guiding the needle through the fabric, mending not just a garment, but her daughter's soul. For all the fame, the lights, the applause, and the endless adoration of millions, this remained the quiet truth at the center of Dolly Parton's heart. The greatest gift she ever received wasn't gold records or standing ovations. It was the love of a mother who taught her that softness is strength, and that kindness is its own kind of courage. And though the woman who gave her that gift is gone, her melody endures, not in charts or trophies, but in every song that reminds the world that love, once given freely, never truly dies. Among all of Dolly Parton's siblings, Floyd Parton was more than just family. He was her mirror in melody, her quiet twin in creation. From their earliest days in Locust Ridge, Tennessee, when the world was no bigger than a front porch and the mountains held their songs like secrets, the two would sit side by side with a battered guitar and scraps of paper covered in lyrics and dreams. They traded lines until words found their perfect home, finishing each other's verses the way only souls born from the same song could. They weren't just brother and sister. They were a duet written by fate. Together, they carried their shared past into melody, their memories stitched into verses the world would one day sing. Songs like Rockin' Years, which soared to #1 in 1991, were born not from ambition, but from understanding and love. Floyd's name appeared quietly in the credits of many of her records, unseen by most. But to Dolly, his presence was everywhere. In her phrasing, in her timing, in the silence between notes. Then, in December 2018, that harmony was broken. Floyd Parton died at the age of 61, and with him, something in Dolly's rhythm fell silent. This loss didn't echo like the others. It was sharper, stranger, a silence she couldn't set to music. "He understood my heart better than most," she once said. "He knew what I meant before I said it." When he was gone, that unspoken language disappeared too. Dolly didn't turn her grief into headlines. There were no televised tributes, no awards show montages, just a short family statement and a quiet funeral. No microphones, no spotlights, where the Partons gathered not as icons, but as children mourning one of their own. In the small chapel nestled in the Tennessee hills, they sang Rockin' Years one last time. No harmony rehearsed, no accompaniment, only trembling voices rising in the air, breaking and reforming like the mountains themselves were listening. Those who were there said, "You could hear the ache in every word." The kind of singing that happens only when hearts are breaking in real time. In the months that followed, friends said a shadow seemed to follow Dolly wherever she went. She kept working, writing, recording, smiling for cameras, but her light felt softer, dimmed by absence. Floyd had been more than a collaborator. He was her bridge back to the barefoot girl who once sang to the hills. Losing him was like losing the map that led her home. For a woman who had always turned pain into poetry, this was a wound too deep for melody. Late at night, she would sit alone with her guitar, fingers hovering over the strings they once played together, unable to finish the verse. The chords now felt incomplete, the harmony missing its answer. Yet even in that silence, something sacred remained. Dolly carried Floyd in every note she sang, not as echo, but as pulse. In those quiet moments on stage, between applause and the next song, her eyes sometimes drift upward, as if listening for a voice the crowd can't hear. Perhaps in those pauses, she still feels him beside her, the brother who once finished her songs, the partner who now waits beyond the melody. And though she still greets the world with her bright smile and golden laugh, somewhere in the shadows of her music lies a verse she will never sing again, but will forever carry in her heart. Some heartbreaks are too raw for melody, too heavy for even the gentlest song to bear. They don't fade. They live quietly in the corners of the soul, where memory hardens into ache. For Dolly Parton, the loss of her beloved niece, Tevar, was that kind of wound, one that no prayer, no song, no stage could ever soften. 36. An age meant for possibility, when mistakes can still be mended, when hope still finds a way to take root. But Tevar's story ended before her song could find its chorus. Her light went out, not in the blaze of fame, but in silence, far from the glitter of Dollywood, far from the roar of applause, leaving behind a hollow that no spotlight could ever reach. Later, reports would say it was an overdose, the final act of a long struggle she had fought bravely, and often alone. Those who knew Dolly say this loss pierced her deeper than any before, because she had seen it coming, the slow unraveling, the quiet cries hidden beneath a smile. Tevar had wrestled with shadows that daylight couldn't chase away, custody battles that broke her spirit, the loneliness of trying to be strong for too long, the pain of a heart too tender for this world. And Dolly, the woman who had spent her life healing others through song, now found herself powerless to save one of her own. She didn't just send help, she stepped into the storm herself, heart first. She paid $25,000 from her own pocket for her niece's rehab, not for image, not for praise, but out of pure, desperate love. She hoped that this time, maybe, the song would find another verse. "I just wanted her to have another chance," she whispered once, when the grief was still too heavy to hide. But the tide didn't turn. The healing never came. And when the music finally stopped, it was not a dramatic ending. It was quiet, as all real heartbreaks are. When the call came, there were no headlines, no public mourning, just a small, private farewell. A few family members gathered in silence, and a woman who had given joy to the whole world now sitting in stillness, her hands trembling around a folded handkerchief. Those close to her say she barely spoke that day. She just stared ahead, as if waiting for her niece to walk through the chapel door. How could a woman who had built schools, fed families, and given books to millions still not find a way to save one life? The one she loved most? That question followed her for months, through recording sessions and long drives home. Tevar's obituary was short. Her life, shorter still. But her absence lingered, in the way Dolly's laughter sometimes caught in her throat, in the pauses between her words, in the silence that followed her songs. Friends would later say she often fell quiet mid-sentence, her eyes glistening, as if hearing a melody only she could hear, the one that ended before its time. For Dolly, that grief became a truth she still carries, a lesson carved into the softest part of her heart, that even the kindest hands can't always pull someone back from the edge, and even the purest love cannot always rewrite fate. Her fame, her fortune, her faith, none could shield her from the quiet brutality of loss. But through the ache, she found something sacred. She learned that love's truest form is not in saving, but in staying, in loving even when the song ends. 36 years old, a life that never reached its bridge, a melody that never found its resolution. And sometimes, she says softly, the hardest part of living is knowing the music stopped before it ever had the chance to soar. There are dreams so tender, so human, that when life takes them away, it doesn't just break your heart, it quiets your soul. For Dolly Parton, that dream was motherhood, a song she could hum, but would never sing out loud. When she married Carl Dean in 1966, she didn't dream of red carpets or flashing lights. She dreamed of a home that smelled of biscuits in bedtime, of tiny shoes lined by the door, of soft laughter in the next room. She imagined a child's giggle bouncing off the walls of a small Tennessee house, not the roar of an audience, but a single, sweet voice calling her by one name, Mama. That picture lived inside her for years, tucked between tour schedules and song lyrics. But in 1982, at 36, life changed its key. A quiet, devastating battle with endometriosis led to surgery that took from her the chance to ever bear a child. When the doctors left and the lights dimmed, she lay still, hands resting over her stomach, realizing she was saying goodbye not just to the idea of motherhood, but to a future she had been building in her heart since she was a girl. She left the hospital carrying more than scars. She carried a silence no medicine could touch. In that silence, every hallway she walked through seemed to echo with lullabies she would never sing. There were no headlines, no cameras, no public mourning, just the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the ticking of a clock in an empty house. Nights stretched long, filled with the kind of stillness that aches. There were no tiny arms around her neck, no giggles tumbling down the hallway, no sleepy voice calling for her in the dark, only quiet, the kind that follows you from room to room, heavy as grief, sharp as absence. For a woman who had turned every hardship into music, this was the one song she could not finish. But Dolly was never made to stay broken. She gathered the fragments of that mother's heart and turned them outward. She poured her love into her siblings' children, into every young dreamer who needed a voice to believe in. And by 1995, that unspent love had found a new home, the Imagination Library, a gift of books and hope to children she would never meet. "If I couldn't have my own," she said once, "I could help raise everyone's." And she meant it. Through every page, every story, every letter sent to small hands around the world, she stitched back together the dream life had torn apart. Still, the ache never vanished. It lingered quietly, surfacing in the smallest, most human ways. The sight of a baby store window lit late at night, a mother and child sharing ice cream on the sidewalk, a lullaby playing faintly from a passing car. In those moments, she felt that old tenderness stir again, the ache of a love that had nowhere to go. She spoke of it rarely, and when she did, it was not with bitterness, but grace. Some things, she said softly once, are meant to grow in other ways. And she believed it. That love, once meant for one child, became the kind that holds the whole world. And yet, when the curtain falls and the lights fade to gold, there are nights when Dolly still feels it, the ghost of a dream brushing past her like a breath. In the quiet, she admits there are songs she's never sung. They live inside her, small and sacred, a lullaby without words, a love without a child, a melody for a baby who was never born, but has always been loved. At the height of her fame, when her name shimmered brighter than the rhinestones on her gowns, Dolly Parton seemed untouchable. To the world, she was a force of nature, unstoppable, radiant, a woman whose laughter could light up an entire arena. But behind the sequins and smiles, her body was fighting a quiet war. What began as exhaustion soon grew into something far more merciless. Years of endless touring, flashing cameras, and sleepless nights had carved deep into her strength. Every song, every handshake, Every dazzling smile came with a cost no one could see. Then came the diagnosis: endometriosis, a cruel reminder that even the brightest stars bleed beneath their glow. It wasn't just an illness. It was betrayal. Her own body, once her greatest instrument, now a battlefield she couldn't escape. Night after night, she stood beneath the stage lights, her voice rising through the pain, her knuckles white around the microphone. Fans saw glitter. They never saw the grimace she hid behind that smile. Backstage, she would steady herself, whispering a vow she'd made since the mountains of her childhood. The show must go on, and it always did. But when the crowds left and the lights went dark, she fell silent. The woman who brought light to millions found herself standing in shadows, asking how much longer she could keep going. Yet the war wasn't only in her body, it was in her heart. She called it an affair of the heart, not scandal, but a quiet unraveling. Fame's demands, family pressures, and the loneliness of being needed by everyone except herself pressed heavy on her spirit. In 1982, her body finally surrendered. Surgery saved her life, but stole something irreplaceable: her dream of motherhood. She woke to a silence no applause could drown out. The nursery she'd imagined would never be filled. The voice that would have called her mama would never be heard. She smiled for cameras, but behind the flashbulbs was a grief without a grave, and a woman trying to make peace with a future she hadn't chosen. Then came the stillness. The exhaustion turned to emptiness. The joy drained from her music. She stopped writing, stopped performing, and for the first time stopped believing that the light would return. It wasn't sadness, she said later. It was nothingness, a gray space where joy used to live. Her friends saw the change. The spark was gone from her laughter. Her eyes dimmed, her body frail from pain and sleeplessness. She withdrew quietly as the world kept spinning without her. And then came the day that nearly ended everything. Alone in her home, surrounded by the suffocating silence of her thoughts, she felt herself sinking into that gray. And then a sound, the soft patting of paws. Popeye, her little dog, had found her. He looked up, eyes wide, asking for nothing but her presence. That tiny heartbeat, that simple, wordless love, pulled her back from the edge. She broke down sobbing, realizing in that moment that she still wanted to stay. She would later say that Popeye saved her life, but in truth, it was her own heart deciding to beat again. The climb back wasn't fast. It wasn't easy, but step by step she rose. She sought help, turned to faith, and began to write again. Not for charts, not for fame, but for survival. The songs that came out of that darkness carried a light she had never known before. Songs written from the bones of her struggle, the quiet triumph of someone who refused to give up. Looking back, she called that time one of the most humbling of my life. It stripped away the glitter and left her with something purer, the understanding that even legends can fall. But what defines them is how they rise. Now, when Dolly speaks of those years, her voice softens, but her eyes shine. The pain taught her compassion. The silence taught her to listen. The scars taught her that real strength isn't the absence of pain. It's the courage to live through it and sing anyway. She says healing didn't come all at once. It came in whispers, in faith, in songs that reminded her she was still here. And so, she sings on, not just for fame or legacy, but for everyone who's ever felt broken. Because if her story proves anything, it's this. Even in the darkest night, a single heartbeat or a single song can be enough to bring you back to life. For decades, Carl Dean was the one person Dolly Parton could truly come home to. The one who loved her not as a legend, not as a brand, but simply as his Dolly. To the world, she was an icon. Sequins, spotlights, songs that crossed oceans. But to him, she was the woman in a faded housecoat, humming in the kitchen at dawn, her hair still undone, her laugh echoing down their quiet hallway. He never called her superstar, he called her baby. In a world that constantly demanded a performance, he was her stillness. When the cameras flashed and the crowds roared, he stayed in the shadows, content to be the silence that steadied her noise. For nearly 60 years, he was her anchor in the storm, her home when the world felt too loud. And then, in 2025, that home fell silent. At 82, Carl slipped away quietly in their Nashville house, the same one where they had shared coffee at sunrise and whispered prayers before sleep. There were no flashing lights, no headlines, no stage to stand on, only the stillness of a room that had lost its heartbeat. That silence cut sharper than grief itself. It wasn't dramatic. It was devastating in its quiet. Friends later said Dolly didn't just lose her husband. She lost the only version of herself that existed before the world took her name and made it golden. In the days that followed, she retreated behind drawn curtains. The phones rang, but she didn't answer. Meals cooled, untouched, on the table. For a woman who had built her life on lifting others, she suddenly couldn't lift her own smile. Even music, the very thing that had carried her through every other loss, betrayed her. She would reach for her guitar, strum a single chord, and feel it vanish, thin as breath, before the sound could form. It felt like even my songs left with him, she would later whisper. When it came time to say goodbye, Dolly refused the world's gaze. She planned the funeral herself, not as a spectacle, but as a love letter, in the small cedar chapel on their property, the same place where Carl used to sit alone in quiet prayer. She filled the room with his favorite wildflowers, the kind he would pick from their land and leave on her kitchen table in a chipped mason jar. Along the altar were photographs no magazine had ever seen. Muddy smiles after planting a garden, Christmas mornings in flannel pajamas, the two of them sitting barefoot on the porch swing, hands tangled together like roots. When she finally stood to speak, she didn't turn to the mourners. Her eyes stayed locked on the casket as if sheer longing could bring him back just for one more laugh, one more breath. Her voice trembled, not from nerves, but from the weight of holding back a lifetime. She thanked him, not for the years, but for the little things, for protecting her from a world that didn't always care who she really was, for loving her when she wasn't Dolly Parton, and for keeping every secret safe. Then she unfolded a yellowed piece of paper, the letter Carl had written years earlier, to be opened after I'm gone. Her hands shook as she read, "You were always my shining star, but I never needed the world to know. Just you." By the time she reached the last line, her voice broke completely. The chapel fell into sacred silence. Then, as if guided by something greater than herself, she reached for her guitar, the one he had bought her before her first hit, and began to play. The melody was fragile, trembling under the weight of her grief. It was a song no one had ever heard before, one she had written decades earlier, just for him. By the final verse, her voice was cracking, her tears falling freely, and every person in that room wept with her, not for the legend they admired, but for the woman they suddenly saw. Small, human, heartbroken, brave. When the last note faded, she set the guitar down and stepped away, not toward the guests, but into the silence that now belonged to her. In the weeks that followed, loneliness became a second skin. Every morning, she still set 2 cups at the table before remembering there was only one. She caught herself turning to speak, only to find an empty chair. Even the air seemed heavier without his laugh to lift it. Carl's death wasn't just the loss of a husband. It was the quiet collapse of the only place she had ever belonged, without earning it. And now, in the quiet house they built together, Dolly still walks the same halls where his shadow lingers. Some nights, she swears she hears him, the soft rhythm of his footsteps on the old wood floor, the faint brush of his hand as she passes the porch swing they once shared. She still sets 2 cups on the counter each morning, out of instinct, out of love. At night, she whispers goodnight into the dark, not out of habit, but because love that deep doesn't vanish. It lingers in the air, in the echoes, in the space between heartbeats. "I've written 1,000 love songs," she once said quietly, but he was the only one that ever truly mattered. Lately, even her body has begun to echo that absence. The woman who once stood unshaken under blinding stage lights now moves a little slower, her voice softer, her breaths shallower. In recent months, her sister asked fans to pray for her, saying Dolly hadn't been feeling her best. She's postponed her Las Vegas shows, the doctors urging rest. But rest has never come easy for a heart that has never stopped giving. As she recovers in Nashville, far from the crowds that once roared her name, the rooms of her home seem to hum with both love and longing. There are nights when the pain from her treatments mingles with memories of the man she lost, and she looks toward the empty side of the bed, whispering that same prayer she used to share with him, trusting he still listens from somewhere she can't yet see. Now, the woman who gave the world endless songs of hope and devotion lives with one last verse, a silence so tender it sings louder than any melody she ever wrote. But within that silence, her love for him and for life itself still burns steady. She once said she didn't fear death, only leaving unfinished songs behind. And perhaps that's her truest legacy. Even as her body bends beneath time and illness, her spirit still hums proof that love, once sung with truth, never dies. It simply changes its key. At 79, Dolly Parton stands at the peak of a life so extraordinary, it seems nothing could be missing. Her name is carved into the granite of music history, her songs stitched into the fabric of generations. Fortune, fame, admiration, she holds them all. And yet, in the vast, echoing halls of her Brentwood, Tennessee estate, the home she shared with Carl Dean for nearly 60 years, the loudest thing left is silence. It's not the soft kind, but the kind that presses against your chest until you remember what used to fill it. The mansion remains immaculate. The gardens bloom defiantly, the fountains still hum, and sunlight spills across marble floors as if nothing has changed. But everything has. On the porch, where she and Carl once talked until dawn, one rocking chair sways gently in the breeze, while the other stays perfectly still. His boots still wait by the door, polished but untouched. His newspaper sits folded on the armchair that will never warm again. Staff move quietly. Family visits with laughter and warmth, but when the cars roll away and the house exhales, the quiet returns. She rises before the sun, not because she must, but because she cannot sleep past the hour when they once shared coffee. In that same kitchen, her hair unpinned, the morning light soft on her face, she brews 2 cups out of habit. One steams gently across from an empty seat. She eats in silence, the clinking of her spoon echoing like a heartbeat she can't quite find. Most mornings, her footsteps lead her down the familiar path to Carl's chapel, a small cedar sanctuary at the edge of their property. The air there smells of wood, candle wax, and prayer. She sits on the first pew, closes her eyes, and hums melodies no one else will ever hear, songs meant for him alone. Sometimes she laughs softly at her own tune, sometimes her eyes glisten. but she never cries for long. He hated to see me sad, she once said, so I try to make the angels smile instead. In those quiet mornings, she isn't a legend, just a woman whispering her love into the stillness, hoping somehow it still reaches him. She has no children of her own, but her love overflows in every direction. In her goddaughter, Miley Cyrus, her nieces and nephews, and in millions of children across the world through her imagination library, which has gifted over 200 million books. She still writes, still tends to Dollywood, still answers letters from fans who tell her that her songs saved their lives. Her catalog, more than 3,000 songs, still earns millions, but she no longer counts by numbers. Carl used to say I was richer in heart than in dollars, she once laughed. And now more than ever, that feels true. Her health, once steady as her stage presence, now carries the weight of time and the quiet dread of what's ahead. Recently, Dolly herself admitted she is preparing to face a series of medical procedures, saying with the same grace she's always shown, "You just have to keep faith." I've faced storms before. Even so, the sparkle has dimmed just slightly. The cameras that once adored her now reveal traces of fatigue, the faint tremor in her hands, the slower rise of her breath between sentences. The voice that once cut through arenas now softens in tone, tender but tired, like silk beginning to fray at the edges. When she canceled her Las Vegas shows and postponed her long-awaited return to the stage, moving her performances from December 2025 to September 2026, her sister Freda took to social media, asking the world to keep Dolly in their prayers. The post spread like wildfire, rippling through millions of hearts that had grown up with her voice. It wasn't just concern, it was collective love, the kind that only someone like Dolly could inspire. Dolly smiled through it, as she always does, assuring her fans she'd be just fine, even joking that her next procedures weren't the kind she used to get from her plastic surgeon. But behind the humor was truth. Those closest to her knew she'd been slowing down, resting more, working less, conserving her strength for the next sunrise. She now calls it a season of stillness, a phrase that feels more like poetry than resignation. Yet even in that stillness, she cannot sit idle. Between doctor visits and quiet recovery days, she still drifts toward her private studio, a warm room filled with light, guitars, and old photos of the people she's loved and lost. There, in the hush between heartbeats, she writes melodies that sound like memories, prayers disguised as lullabies, each note a promise that the music, like her spirit, will never fade. Even as her body slows, her soul keeps time to a rhythm only she can hear, the rhythm of endurance, of faith, of love that refuses to end. There are very few souls whose lives feel larger than the music they create. Dolly Parton is one of them. She is not merely a singer. She is a living testament to what the human spirit can endure and what it can give when it chooses love over bitterness, grace over fame, and faith over fear. From that one-room cabin in the Smoky Mountains to the grandest stages on earth, her story has never been just about success. It has been about survival. Every lyric she's written carries the fingerprints of pain, perseverance, and prayer. She turned struggle into symphony and heartache into hymn. And now, as she enters one of the most delicate chapters of her journey, her slowing steps, her postponed shows, her sister Freda's midnight plea for prayers, the world holds its breath once again for the woman who taught it how to keep going. It's rare to see someone who has given so much now learning, perhaps for the first time, to rest. Yet even in this stillness, Dolly continues to give. Her words are still gentle, her humor unbroken, her heart as generous as ever. When asked about her upcoming medical procedures, she smiled and said, "Honey, I've been through worse. The Lord's got me." That is the faith that built her. The same faith that can turn pain into purpose and silence into song. For nearly 8 decades, Dolly's voice has been the heartbeat of compassion. A voice that comforts the lonely, lifts the weary, and reminds the world that love can survive anything. She turned poverty into poetry, loss into legacy, and heartbreak into hope. When she sings, it isn't just melody, it's memory. When she smiles, it isn't performance, it's forgiveness. And when she stumbles, it isn't weakness, it's grace in motion. Her story reminds us that beauty isn't in perfection, but in persistence, in the light that keeps shining through the cracks. As she faces this new season, may we hold her in the same light she has always shone upon us. Let us send her not pity, but power, not fear, but faith. Let our prayers rise for her health, her healing, and her peace, for the hands that once played through pain, for the heart that never stopped loving. May the same God who carried her through the mountains now hold her gently through the valley. So tonight, wherever you are, if her songs have ever mended something in you, if Coat of Many Colors made you feel seen, or I Will Always Love You helped you say goodbye, take a moment, whisper her name, say a prayer. Leave your love in the comments below. Because legends don't just belong to history, they belong to hearts. And finally, perhaps the truest way to honor Dolly Parton is not simply to celebrate her songs, but to live the way she has always sung, with kindness that asks for nothing in return, love that endures every storm, and courage that keeps shining even when the lights go dim. For the world may one day quiet, but her song, her spirit will never fade, because some voices once heard echo forever.